Hello, everyone. We are happy to have two colleagues within our around our table. My name is Goodhart. I am professor at the Department of Bioethics, and I'm very proud to introduce the fifth event of the cycle of lectures that consists of six. That should consist of six events, six meetings. So this is the fifth one, and the lectures are led by Professor Sandor Goodhart from the USA, Purdue University. And Sandor Goodhart is a recognized expert in Levinas in philosophy, professor emeritus of English and Jewish studies at Purdue University, former director of religious studies program, Jewish studies program, philosophy and literature program, classical studies program. Also author or editor of 7 books, author of over 100 essays in philosophy. And we are very proud that Professor has been collaborating with LSMO for a couple of years by giving several talks at local and international conferences organized at the Levinas Center. And so we are very excited that Professor has stayed for the second week, for the third week in Kaunas. And so we will be happy to hear a talk based on Dostoyevsky's short story. Now, before we start, we would like to thank to the Baltic American Freedom Foundation for funding the professor's visit to LSMO. And the session is recorded, and it will be available on YouTube sometime later. So, dear Professor, floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Levinas. I'm very happy to be here and to engage in the fifth lecture. We started with an overview of Levinas, philosophy of Levinas, in the first lecture, and then we moved to discussion of Sophocles and Oedipus Tyrannus, and then to the Bacchae, which was the play of Euripides, the third lecture. Then we moved to Shakespeare last time with Othello, and this time we're going to take a look at a short story of Dream of a Ridiculous Man, The Dream of a Ridiculous Man, in the Constance Garnett translation, which is the standard and the most famous translation of Dostoevsky in English. The thesis that I've been suggesting is that Levinas's notion of responsibility, the ability to respond, is a critical idea that could be used in medical ethics, the application of medical ethics, and that becomes an important way to think about doctor-patient, doctor-client relationships. And we're going to take the next week, not this week, but the next week, to just consider the whole field. And we have an article that we will share next week, and I believe it's going to be shared to some extent online in the chat, maybe.
Yeah. Sorry, yes, the week on Thursday.
Thursday. I mean Thursday. I'm sorry.
2 days.
2 days. This Thursday. Today's Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday. In English. This Thursday. And this article by Lazar Ben-Arroyo, which addresses exactly this question, the significance of Levinas's notion of responsibility for the application to medical ethics. My thesis for this course has been that we can look at the history of literature from the ancient world through the Renaissance, at least in English, to the 19th century, to understand a certain progress in the understanding of responsibility as literature thinks about it. And so we started, just to give you a very, very thumbnail summary here, we started by looking at two ancient writers, Sophocles and Euripides, and what we said was that Sophocles was critical of the structure in which the play would normally already be presumed to be operative, which is to say the sacrificial structure, the structure of the theater of Dionysus, which is the origin of the ritual myth of Dionysus is considered to be the origin of the theater, according to Aristotle and according to a number of other readers of the play. And then that when we get to Shakespeare, this criticism that has been lodged, which is not, it's a criticism that's lodged without proposing an alternative. It's simply saying that the sacrificial is not working. Sophocles is saying the sacrificial is not working. The sacrificial, based as it is, and we try to be very specific about this, on a scapegoat mechanism. We use the work of René Girard, the French critic, whose work has been gaining increasing notoriety since his passing in 2015. That basically all of culture is organized around the scapegoat mechanism, which structures the capacity to distinguish the sacred from violence. And that there's the sacred is out there and violence is here, and this mechanism is sustained by the making sacred, the sacrificial, making Latin picora, to make sacred, through a substitution of a scapegoat victim, of a bouc émissaire in French, as it is said. But that for Sophocles and for Euripides, the enactment, and Euripides is quite explicit in the enactment of this sacrificial scapegoating in the Bacchae. But what we saw was that the origin of the theater gets enacted in the theater in the case of the Bacchae. When we come to Shakespeare, the sacrificial structure we're now looking at is the structure, in some sense, of warfare that's taking place between the Venetians and those who are perceived to be non-Venetians, specifically the Turks and other groups that are not identified with Venetian, really Roman culture. And that Shakespeare is trying to show us the ways in which there's a certain self-destructive element in this sacrificial behavior that's taking place in Othello, and that these characters, virtually every one of them, is destroying themselves. They are destroying themselves. And so literally, Othello takes the knife and kills himself. Desdemona seems to die of grief because she's smothered, but then she wakes up from being smothered, and she seems to die of grief. And so we're wondering, aloud, to what extent there's a self-destructive element in applying the sacrificial system, and whether some alternative methods of thinking might be in place. And with Dostoyevsky, we begin to get a formulation of what they could look like. And the notion of responsibility will actually appear in the text. And of course, what we're teaching here in this whole course is reading, is a process of reading. What we're teaching is that there have been in the West really two fundamentally different ways of organizing what it is that you take in when you look out and you have sensory data, and you can organize them in at least two, but probably many more ways. But the two major ways, one comes from Plato, in which you say, here's what seems to be, but here's what is. And we talked about the truth, right? The truth is what is, what has being. The truth is that which has being, as opposed to that which does not have being. But there's what seems to be, but only seems to be, but in relationship to being. But there's another way of thinking, which is really the way that the ancient Greeks thought of thinking prior to Plato, which was the way the tragedy thought about it. That what's sometimes been called the tragic prophetic, and prophetic takes the form of both the figure of Tiresias actually in both places, in the Bacchae and in Oedipus, but also in the form of the oracle. The Delphic oracle would be one example. And the oracular, in the oracular understanding, one looks at the strategies, the origins, and the consequences. One looks horizontally, so to speak. What happened before? What's happening now? What's happening in the future? And one looks at actions, that is to say. And the notion of phenomenology as particular development within the history of philosophy for Levinas is specifically about actions as opposed to meanings, right? We've often talked about the meaning of this or the meaning of that. But what Levinas found extremely valuable when he studied with Edmund Husserl was that Husserl was developing a phenomenology, and a phenomenology for as Levinas understood it was, as Levinas calls it, intentionalities. But intentionalities not meaning what it is that I hold in my head as what I would like to do, but what are the actual agendas? What are the forms of action that take place in front of us? And so what Levinas tried to do was to read, after he was a prisoner of war, he tried to read the notion of fatigue or indolence or other ideas that are not normally read within philosophy, read within what he called a phenomenology, this new method of reading that reads actions rather than meanings, or reads actions in context of which meanings are then derived. So meanings become secondary to the actions taking place. And again, we made a reference, for example, to a really fairly famous book by J.L. Austin called "How to Do Things with Words" and the difference between performatives and descriptives or constitutives that we were talking about. Today, what we're going to do is look at Dostoyevsky, because Dostoyevsky takes a kind of critical step beyond simply being critical of sacrificial structure and actually moves towards what we could identify as responsibility and the nature of prophetic thinking that I've been trying to argue that literature is about. I think, bottom line for me is that literature within this phenomenology of literary reading, which is really what I'm developing, I guess, it's a way of reading prophetically. It's understanding literature through the prophetic. Prophetic has been, I certainly didn't invent this. William Blake talked about prophetic reading in the literary, but what I'm trying to do is trying to establish a way in which Levinas offers us, through the notion specifically of responsibility, ability to respond, a way of understanding what's taking place in literature. So we're going to spend a lot of time today, as perhaps more so than in the past, with reading. And we're going to put the text up in front of you on the screen, and we're going to try to read through it together. And it's short. It's a short story. But in order to do that, I want to set the context, because to read prophetically is to understand the context in which something is coming up, to what extent it's an action takes place in a context. We only understand things by virtue of the context. I mean, it's been said often by Jacques Derrida and lots of other people that there is no such thing as a text. There's only a text in a context. A context is what determines the text, but we can't see the context until we, in some sense, understand the text that's already presupposing that context. Historically, Dostoyevsky writes this particular short story late in his life. This is really one of the last short stories that he writes. It's often reproduced. It's reproduced here's a collection of books by. It's a collection of ideas by not ideas, but stories by fictions by Dostoyevsky, and it's the Andrew McAndrew edition, and it contains, as lots of these collections of Dostoyevsky's work contain, The Dream of a Ridiculous Man at the end. So I just want to take just two minutes here very quickly to say when I actually conceived of doing this series of presentations that Professor Urbanus and I talked about, I thought first what we should read is Notes from the Underground. That seems to me that was very powerful because it's powerful in the context of Dostoyevsky's life. So I want to just talk Dostoyevsky's life, Notes from the Underground, and then we'll get to Dream from just so you know the itinerary here. Dostoyevsky grew up on a large I don't know if you would call it a plantation, but this is there were serfs and there were people that were in charge. This was a very wealthy context, but the individuals who were considered to be the serfs were very unhappy, and there was a rebellion against it. And Dostoyevsky, strangely enough, seemed to side, at least from the notes that we're able to take from this, with the serfs against his father, against the others, and so. There's a kind of fundamental conflict for Dostoyevsky in relationship to his father. Once his father dies and Dostoyevsky gets older, he joins a series of radical thinkers, and he's working with them, thinking about being an activist in various ways in Russian society, against the Tsar in the 19th century. And he is one day at a meeting when someone from the Tsar's royal circle shows up and arrests him and everyone else at the meeting. And they said, because you have been doing this, we're going to kill you. We're going to assassinate you. And the story goes that Dostoevsky was lined up with 5 other people. He was in group 2, group 3, and then 2. And they were set up. They were, I don't know if they were blindfolded or not, but they were set up ready to be killed and the guards had the guns. The military people who were going to kill them had their guns ready, being raised. They said, okay, 1, 2, and just before they say 3, someone shows up from the Tsar and said, this was just to make our point, just to show you that we really mean business. You're all not free to go, but we're not going to kill you. Dostoevsky is sent to, I believe, Siberia at that point. One of the individuals who is, I believe, in the first faints, one of the individuals in the first group faints. Dostoevsky ends up writing novels for the rest of his life, writing fictions and stories about his life. So this gives you some very, very, very simplistic sense of the context in which Dostoevsky is working against. He goes to prison, and when he comes out of prison, he writes Notes from the Underground. It's the first really big thing that he writes. And then he will write his big novels, the famous novels, the Brothers Karamazov, The Idiot, The Possessed, Crime and Punishment, all the books that we often cite when we talk about Dostoevsky afterwards. So Notes from the Underground is written before. And I just want to give you a quote from, I don't want to forget it, this quote from Brothers Karamazov, which has to do with responsibility, and maybe it will give you some sense of why he put so much stock in this. The Brothers Karamazov is about the murder of a father. I mean, you can understand how this would be interesting for Dostoevsky to be thinking about the murder of a father. But the lead character, Dmitri, did not do it. It was done by Smerdyatkin, another character in one of the brothers, maybe a half brother or something like that. But it was not done by Dmitri. But at some point, Dmitri is accused of having killed the father. And Dmitri ends up saying, and this is an extraordinary statement. He said, I realized that I am guilty of everything before everyone, and me more than anyone. That's extraordinary. Right? I'm guilty of everything. There's nothing leaks out. I'm guilty of everything in front of everyone, and me more than anyone. Right? That's quite extraordinary, and therefore that is for Dmitri the ultimate assumption of responsibility. It seems to me that's how Dostoevsky conceives of assuming responsibility, even though he didn't do it. In other words, he didn't kill the. We know factually within the novel that Dmitri didn't do it, but he's willing to take responsibility as if he had done it, even though he didn't do it. And that's so responsibility is that serious, is that powerful, is that all-encompassing. But before he gets to Notes from the Underground, before he gets to Brothers Karamazov, he writes Notes from the Underground. Notes from the Underground will begin and here's why I'm mentioning it here, not just because I was going to start with it, but because I think it's very similar to the text that we are going to read here. Notes from the Underground begins with a man who feels that he's been left out of culture. He's not happy. He's also thinks, which is the opening statement of the story we're going to read. He says, I'm a ridiculous man. I know it. I know it more than anyone else. I am ridiculous. Was ridiculous. But I know it even better now. But this is also the way in which the underground man starts in the book Notes from the Underground. The novella is only about 90 pages or so. And he tells the story of what he's calling the interest in the 19th century in the Crystal Palace, which was a way of the advent of science and the scientific ways of thinking about things. And he thinks that he said one day we will be invented by science entirely. One can today, with technology going the way it is, imagine the fulfillment of that Crystal Palace-based dream that the underground man imagines. And by the way, he's never given the name. He's always called the Underground Man. He's, that becomes his name, the Underground Man. And that's part one of the Underground Man. But what's interesting, and it goes on for quite a long time, but then in part two, and sometimes when people teach the underground, they only include part one, where he gives his philosophic critique of the Crystal Palace. In part two, we see him interacting with other people. So it's a novel. It's a fiction. And what's interesting is that in that interaction with other people, he turns out to be identical to the people he's critical of. In part one, he's establishing himself. I'm alone. They are together. I'm different from everyone. I'm worse or I'm better, but I'm absolutely different. And in part two, he turns out to be absolutely the same. And there's no different. And in fact, he becomes, in some ways, even worse because he kind of seduces. He goes to a brothel and he seduces one of the individuals in the brothel to come back, who then comes back to his house. And although he secretly hates her, but he also is taking pride in the fact that he's able to convince her that she hates her job and hates herself and really should quit it and fall in love with someone like him. And in fact, she seems to do that, and they actually make love, and then he begins to mock her and to attack her, and then she finally gets up and leaves and realizes what she's dealing with, and she's gone from the picture. And then he says at the very end, he says, I realized I could not live my life except in terms of such bad literature. I'm always thinking in terms of literature and acting and mimetically reproducing the literature that I read, acting out. Like Plato said, when you go to the theater, we end up going home and thinking of ourselves as the hero and acting out the dramas that we see going on in front of us in the theater. So what the underground man ends up saying is, I'm stuck here. But I might as well stop. But then someone else at the very end of the underground man enters the picture. Someone else says, but this man of paradoxes could not stop there. But we, whoever this we is, are of the opinion that it's time to stop. And that's how the story ends. Now, what happens after that is that, in fact, Dostoyevsky does not stop. He goes on and writes The Possessed and The Idiot and Brothers Karamazov. And then afterwards, and Brothers Karamazov, by the way, this last big book was just to be one of a trilogy. And we know from the notes that we have the notes from Brothers Karamazov, not the notes from the underground, but the notes that Dostoyevsky wrote about what he was writing, that this was to be a story of Alyosha, one of the young characters in Brothers Karamazov, who was to lose his faith and then to regain another kind of faith later on. And he never lived to write it. So we don't know whether that would have been what happened or not, because Dostoyevsky passed away after writing Brothers Karamazov. He never wrote the next next two installments of that trilogy. But what he did do is write A Dream of a Ridiculous Man. So in some ways, you're seeing Dostoyevsky at his most progressive, at his most developed sense of responsibility. In fact, the word in the Constance Garnett for responsibility shows up. So I'm going to, while I'm talking, my computer kind of went back off and on. So I'm going to just take a second here and gain access to it again. All right, there we go. Okay, so now we're going to put up Dream of a Ridiculous Man on the screen, and we're just going to start reading. Today, what we're doing is going to read together and think about what we're having. Now, that, of course, is what we're going to look at next week, but there's the Underground Man. Looks like the Underground Man, yeah. Go back to the very beginning of that, the top of that. I am a ridiculous person. There we go. Can we make it any bigger? Is there any way of, can you see that? You were able to read it? Okay, good. All right, So all right, we're going to start. I'm a ridiculous person. Now they call me a madman. That would be a promotion but I remain as ridiculous in their eyes as before. But now I did not resent it. They're all dear to me now. They even laugh at me. Indeed, it is just when they are laughed at, they're particularly dear to me. I would join their laughter, not exactly at myself, but through affection for them. If I did not feel so sad as I look at them, sad because they do not know the truth. I know. So this is going to be an essay about the truth that he knows. This character, the dream of a ridiculous man, the truth that he knows. Oh, how hard it is to be the only one who knows the truth. So this kind of sounds like the Underground Man a little bit, right? I know the truth. I'm alone. They're together. So even though he's saying, I think I understand what's going on, he's also doing exactly what the Underground Man did. And what we saw in the Underground Man and in each of the novels, by the way, was that the character who presents himself as an outsider turns out to be simply a double of everyone else until finally that gets confessed by Dmitri, as I say, I am guilty of everything before. Even if I didn't do it, I'm guilty of it. Yeah, okay. Which means I'm a double of the others. I'm not different from the others. I simply construct myself egoistically as different, but in fact, I'm not different. And everyone else is constructing themselves egoistically as different, identically to the way I'm doing it. Oh, how hard it is, Dostoyevsky writes in the end, or the character writes at the end of the first paragraph, to be the only one who knows the truth. But they won't understand that. No, they will not understand. And there it goes. Now he's into the differences. Okay. So in the old days, and each paragraph is slightly different from before. In the old days, I used to be miserable at seeming ridiculous. Not seeming, but actually being ridiculous. I've always been ridiculous, and I have always known it. Perhaps from the hour I was born, perhaps from the time I was 7 years old, I knew I was ridiculous. Afterwards, I went to school. I studied at the university, and the more I learned, the more thoroughly I understood that I was ridiculous. So it seemed to me at the end as though all the sciences I studied at university existed only to prove and make evident to me as I went more deeply into them that I was ridiculous. So I'm simply learning about myself. I'm not learning anything about anyone else. I'm just learning how ridiculous I am. It was the same life as it was, the same with life as it was with science, which is what he wrote about, of course, in Underground Man. With every year, the same consciousness of the ridiculous figure that I cut in every relation and grew strengthened. Everyone laughed at me, always laughed at me, but not one of them guessed or knew or guessed that if there were any one man on earth who knew better than anyone else that I was absurd, it was me. I was ridiculous. And what I resented most of all was that they didn't know that. They didn't recognize that. You see all the signs of it. There's different ways in which, okay. They didn't know that. But that was my own fault. I was so proud that nothing would have ever induced me to tell it to anyone. This pride that I had ruined me over the years. And if it happened that I allowed myself to confess to anyone that I was ridiculous, I believe I should have blown my brains out that very year, which is what he's going to do in the story. I don't know if you've read the story, you know what's coming down the pike. And that's basically what's going to happen here. He's going to attempt to do that. Oh, how I suffered in my early youth from the fear that I might give way and confess to my schoolfellows. But since I grew to manhood, I have for some unknown reason become calmer. Though I realized my awful characteristic more fully every year. I say unknown for this day. I can't tell why it was. Perhaps it was owing to the terrible misery that was growing in my soul through something of more consequence than anything else about me. Something was the conviction that had come upon me that nothing in the world mattered. I mean, this is before Heidegger, right? This is 19th century. Heidegger will say entire philosophy will take, the question of Leibniz in philosophy. Why is there nothing? Why is there something rather than nothing? And Heidegger will say, no, there's not. There's nothing in place of something. And so Heidegger will make a thinking about nothing. I would argue that actually not only Dostoyevsky but Shakespeare also writes about this in Hamlet and in Richard II. I'll just quote very briefly. I think I mentioned this in the course before. When Richard II, the king, is in prison and is going to be killed, he says, "Neither I nor any man that but man is with nothing shall be pleased till he be eased with being nothing." And it seems to me at the heart of Shakespeare's work is the understanding that being is a form of being nothing. It's a construct. The being is a construction. That what I think of as being, or as the verb, as Heidegger would put it, the verbal action of being is a form of turning nothing into the illusion that it's something, into the illusion that it's something. Anyway, that's their philosophy. I'm not giving you an argument here. I'm simply trying to read these texts and how they're presenting it. And here we have that idea right here in Dostoevsky. Okay. That nothing, the idea come to me, nothing in the world mattered. I had a long time, I had an inkling of it. But the full realization came last year almost suddenly, and that's what this story is going to be about. I suddenly felt it was all the same to me whether the world existed or whether there had never been anything at all. I began to feel with all my being that there was nothing existing. And at first, I fancied that many things had existed in the past, but afterwards, I guessed there had never been anything in the past either, and that it only seemed to me for some, this is Plato, of course, seeming and being. Seemed for some reason, little by little, I guessed that there would be nothing in the future either. Then I left off being angry and almost ceased to notice them. Indeed, this showed itself even in the pettiest trifles. I used, for example, to knock against people in the street, and not so much from being lost in thought, but what had I to think about? And again, because we're reading, and I want to give you context. There's an incident in Notes from the Underground in which he meets an officer. He's walking the street, and he knocks against him, and he thinks, okay, we're going to have a confrontation now. And he thinks about that for years, literally, and then finally he we'll attack each other, and he writes letters to him. And then he said, we will become friends, we'll become best. And then about 2 weeks after, he's been thinking about this, he meets him, and the guy just totally ignores him. Doesn't think anything about him at all. So you realize the whole thing has been a fantasy he's invented in his own mind from the fact that simply he bumped into someone on the street. So he's kind of referring in some ways to the writer who wrote Underground Man in a certain way. All right, so then I left off being angry with people, almost ceased to notice them. I even pettiest trifles to knock against people in the street, not so much from being lost in thought, but after all, what had I to think about? I'd almost given up by that time, but nothing mattered to me. If at least I had solved my problems, I had not solved them, and how many of my problems there were. But I gave up caring about anything, and all the problems suddenly disappeared. All right, and after that, it was that I discovered the truth. Okay, so it comes back to this truth that it's going to talk about now. I learned the truth November 3rd. He actually gives a date for it, in a week before the American elections, a couple days before American elections. All right, 3rd of November to be precise. And I remember every instant since. It was gloomy evening, one of the gloomiest possible evenings. I was going home at 11 o'clock at night. I remember I thought the evening could not be gloomier, so it's filled with gloom. Even physically, rain had been falling all day, and it had been cold, gloomy. Look how many times the word gloomy gets used here in this text. Gloomy, almost menacing with rain. I remember unmistakable spite against mankind for the gloominess, I guess. Suddenly, between 10 and 11, it had stopped and was followed. I skipped the page there. Okay, it suddenly between 10 and 11 it had stopped and was followed by a horrible dampness, colder and damper than the rain, and a sort of steam was rising up from everything. I guess that's the page. From every stone in the street and from every lane that one looked down. A thought suddenly occurred to me that if all the street lamps had been put out, it would have been less cheerless than the gas made one's heart sadder because it lighted it all up. I had scarcely any dinner today. I had been spending the evening with an engineer and two other friends. I sat there, fancied that I bored them. They talked of something rousing, and suddenly they got excited over it. They did not really care. I could see that. And it only made a show of being excited. I suddenly said to them, my friends, you don't really care one way or another about what you're talking about. It's a way of making yourself ingratiated to your colleagues. They were not offended, but they laughed at me. And that was because I spoke without any reproach at all, simply because it did not matter to me. They saw it not, it amused them. And I was thinking about gas lamps in the street. I looked up in the sky. The sky was horribly dark, but one could distinctly see tattered clouds, and between them, fathomless black patches. Real nothingness. I'm really looking up at the nothingness there. Suddenly, I noticed in one of these patches a star. Began to watch it intently. This is going to play a role later in the story. A star. It was because it had given me an idea. I had decided to kill myself that night. That was the idea I had. I had firmly determined to do it 2 months before, and as poor as I was, I bought a gun. I bought a splendid revolver, and I loaded it. 2 months had passed, and it was still lying in my drawer. I was so utterly indifferent. I wanted to seize the moment when I would not be so indifferent. I don't know why, but for 2 months, every night I came home, I thought I would shoot myself. I kept waiting for the right moment. And so now this star gave me a thought. I made up my mind that it should certainly be that night I'm going to kill myself. And why the star gave me a thought, I don't know. No idea. All right. Okay. So, and it's just as I was looking at the sky, this little girl took me by the elbow, wrapped the elbow. The street was empty. There was scarcely anyone to be seen. A cabman was sleeping in the distance. It was a child of 8 with a kerchief on her head, wearing nothing but a wretched little dress, all soaked with rain. But I noticed I noticed her wet, broken shoes, and I recall them even now. They caught my eye particularly. She suddenly pulled me by the elbow, called me. She was not weeping, but was spasmodically crying out some words which could not utter properly because she was shivering and she was shuddering and she was in terror about something and kept crying, "Mommy, mommy." I turned facing her. I did not say a word and went on, but she ran pulling at me, and there was a note in her voice which in frightened children means despair. I know that sound, though she did not articulate the words. I understood that her mother was dying. Mother was dying. Or that something of the sort was happening to them, and that she had run out to call someone, to find someone to help her mother. I did not go with her. On the contrary, I had the impulse to drive her away. I told her first to go to a policeman. But clasping her hands, she ran beside me, sobbing, gasping, would not leave me. I stamped my foot and shouted at her. She called out, "Sir, sir," but suddenly abandoned me and rushed headlong across the street. Some other passerby, I guess, appeared there, and she evidently flew from me to him. I mounted up my 5th story, and I have a room in the flat where there are other lodgers. My room is small, poor, with a garret window in the shape of a semicircle. I have a sofa covered with American leather, a table with books on it, 2 chairs, a comfortable armchair, old as can be, but old-fashioned shape. I sat down, lighted the candle, began thinking. The room next to mine, through the partition wall, a perfect bedlam was going on. It had been going on for 3 days. A retired captain lived there, and he had a dozen visitors, gentlemen of doubtful reputation, drinking vodka, playing stoss with old cards. The night before there had been a fight, and I know the 2 of them had been there for a long time, engaged in the dragging each other out by the hair. The landlady wanted to complain, but she was in abject terror of the captain. There was only one other lodger in the flat, a little regimental lady on visit from St. Petersburg with 3 children who had been taken ill, and they had come to lodging. Both she and the children were in mortal fear of the captain, who lay trembling and crossing them all night. And the youngest child had a sort of fit of fright. That captain, I know for a fact, sometimes stops people in the street in Nevsky Prospect, which is in the neighborhood, and wouldn't take him into the service. But strange to say, that's why I keep telling you, all that month the captain had been here, his behavior caused me no annoyance. I have, of course, tried to avoid his acquaintance from the very beginning, and he too was bored with me from the first. But why is he? We, as a reader, we might wonder, why is he telling us all this right now? What's going on here? He's kind of diverting attention of the reader from what took place, right? This is a strategy of some kind. Why is he doing this? He too was bored with me in the first. I never cared how much. On the other side of the partition, how many of them there were. And I sat up all night. And forget them so completely that don't even hear them. Right. So I guess we're the next page and not even hear them. Right. So that I stay up until daybreak, and I've been going on like that for the last year. I sit up all night. Again, why is he going on with this, rather than talking about other things? I sit up all night in the chair. I only read by day. I sit. I don't even think. Ideas of a sort wander through my mind, let them come and go. A whole candle is burned every night. I sat down at the table, took out the revolver, put it before me. And when I put it, I asked myself, I remember, is that so? Whatever that means. Is that so? And I answered with complete conviction, yeah, it is. Whatever that means, again. Yeah. Do you want to say that?
Yeah, sorry to interrupt, but can't we here see like your intentionality? No? Your intentionality.
Well, yes.
He's just describing actions.
He's describing his actions. Exactly. That's right. He's describing the actions. He's giving a phenomenology. Of the writer is giving a phenomenology. What said was exactly right. That's right. You see, All right. But listen, I shall, that is so. An answer with complete conviction. That is, I shall shoot myself. I knew that will shoot myself for certain that night, but how much longer I should go on sitting at the table, I don't know. And no doubt I should have shot myself if it had not been for that little girl. Okay, now we're going to come back to the little girl. Okay. You see, though nothing mattered to me, I could feel pain. For instance, if someone had struck me, it would have hurt me. It was the same morally. If anything pathetic happened, I should have felt pity, just as I used to do in the old days when there were things in life that didn't matter to me. I felt pity that evening. I should have certainly helped a child. Why then had I not helped the little girl? Because of an idea that occurred to me at the time when she was calling and pulling at me. A question suddenly arose in front of me, and I could not settle it. The question was an idle one, but I was vexed, and I was vexed at the reflection that if I were going to make an end of myself that night, which you remember he decided to kill himself that night, nothing in life ought to have mattered to me. Why was it that all of a sudden I did not feel a strange pang, quite incongruous to my position? Really, I don't know any better how to convey my fleeting sensation, but the sensation persisted at home when I was sitting at the table, and I was very much irritated, as I had not been in a long time. One reflection followed another. I saw clearly. Things not moving here. I saw clearly, so long as I was still a human being and not nothingness. And there's a key idea. I was a human being and not nothingness. I was alive, and so I could suffer and be angry and feel shame and at my actions, and so be it. But if I was going to kill myself in 2 hours, say, what is the little girl to me, and what have I to do with shame or anything else in the world? I shall turn into nothing, absolute nothing. Right? This is not about a Christian believer of some kind. This is someone for whom there's nothing after this, right? And can it be true that the consciousness that I shall completely cease to exist immediately, and so everything else will cease to exist for me? Does not in the least affect my feeling of pity for the child? So shouldn't that child have some relationship to me, a feeling of shame after a contemptible action such as the one that I did? I stamped and I shouted at the unhappy child as though to say, not only I feel no pity, but even if I behave inhumanly and contemptibly, I am free to do it. For another 2 hours, everything will be extinguished. Do you believe that was why I shouted that? I almost am convinced of it now, even. It seemed clear to me that life and the world somehow depended upon me. Now, that's ego, that's pure ego. Depended upon me now. I may almost say that the world now seemed created for me alone. If I shot myself, the world would cease to exist, at least for me. I say nothing of its being likely that nothing will exist for anyone when I'm gone, and that soon as my consciousness is extinguished, the whole world will vanish too and become a void like a phantom, a mere appurtenance of my consciousness. For possibly all this world and all these people are only me, myself. And in a certain way, it seems to me it's kind of Dostoyevsky's definition of ego, of the ego-logical structure in which we all function, as if everything is really just a fiction for me, a construction. It's all construction, and it's a construction with the purpose that I should understand it as a construction.
Some sort of solipsism.
So complete solipsism. Yeah. Seems to me that that's how the underground man at this point is, this particular underground man is functioning. I remember that as I sat and I reflected, and I turned all these new questions that swarmed one after another, quite the other way. And the thought of something quite new. For instance, a strange reflection suddenly occurred to me that if I had lived before on the moon or on Mars, there had committed the most disgraceful and dishonorable action, I guess as he's thinking he did with the girl, and had been put on, and had there been put to such shame and ignominy as one can only conceive and realize in dreams or nightmares. And if finding myself afterwards on the earth, I were able to retain a memory of what I had done on the other planet, and at the same time knew that it should never, under any circumstances, return there, Then looking from the earth to the moon, should I care or not care? Should I feel shame for the action or not? And if there were idle and superfluous, these were idle and superfluous questions, for the revolver was already lying in front of me, and I knew in every fiber of my being that it would happen for certain, but they excited me, and I raged, and I could not die now without having first settled something. In short, the child had saved me. For I put off my pistol shot for the sake of the questions. Meanwhile, the clamor had begun to subside in the captain's room. They had finished their game. They were settling down to sleep. And meanwhile, they're grumbling and languidly winding up their quarrels. At that point, I suddenly fell asleep in my chair at the table, a thing which had never happened before to me. And I dropped asleep quite unawares. Right? And then now we go on to dreams, as we all know. Queer things. Some parts are presented with appalling vividness, worked up with elaborate finish of jewelry, while others gallop through, though as it were, without noticing them all. For instance, through space and time. Dreams seem to be spurred on, not by reason, but by desire. Not by the head, but by the heart. And what complicated tricks my reason has played sometimes in dreams, what utterly incomprehensible things happen to it. My brother died 5 years ago, for instance. I sometimes dream of him. He takes part in my affairs. We are very much interested, and yet all through my dream, I quite know and quite remember that my brother is dead and buried. How is it that I am not surprised that, though he is dead, he is here beside me and working with me? Why is it that my reason fully accepts it? But enough. I will begin about my dream. Yes, I dreamed a dream. Now we're going to begin to get his dream. My dream of the 3rd of November. They tease me now, telling me it was only a dream, but does it matter whether it was a dream or reality if the dream made known to me the truth? And he would come back to that idea of the truth in the beginning. If one has recognized the truth and seen it, you know it, that it is the truth, and that there is no other, and there cannot be any other, whether you are asleep or awake. Let it be a dream, so be it, okay. But that real life of which you make so much, I meant to extinguish by suicide in my dreams. My dream, it revealed to me a different life, a renewed, grand life, and one full of. Okay, so that's what this story is going to be about then. One full of power.
No,
yes.
This site reminds me of Slavoj Žižek.
Zizek.
Yeah, the dream is like escape into reality and not escape from reality.
Into reality, yes. That's interesting. I like that idea. All right, I've kind of lost my place here. Creative, okay, show me reflected, and then, okay, so I guess, all right, my computer's going a little nuts here. Sorry about this. I'm going to come back and bring it back up here. We're to nothing matters to me, and I could feel pain. We read that.
Chapter 3.
Chapter 3.
Yeah.
There we go. Chapter 3. Done. Thank you. All right. Chapter 3. Listen. All right. I've mentioned that I dropped asleep unawares, even though, and even seemed to be still reflecting on the same subjects. I suddenly dreamt that I picked up the revolver and aimed it straight at my heart, and not at my head. And I had determined beforehand to fire at my head and at my right temple. After aiming at my chest, I waited a second or two, and suddenly my table, and the wall in front of me began moving and heaving. I made haste to pull the trigger. In dreams, you sometimes fall from a height or a stabbed or beaten, but you never feel pain unless perhaps you really bruise yourself against the bedstead. Then you feel pain and almost always wake up in front of it. Wake up from it. It was the same in my dream. I did not feel any pain, but it seemed as though with my shot, everything within me was shaken and everything was suddenly dimmed. I know what it is. I've lost the little. There it is. Okay, got it. Everything within me was suddenly dimmed. Okay. Suddenly jumped back to chapter 3 is what it did there. Is suddenly dimmed. Okay. All right. So it did, and it grew horribly black around me. I seemed to be blinded and benumbed, and I was lying on something hard, stretched on my back. I saw nothing, could not make even the slightest movement. People were walking and shouting around me. The captain bawled. The landlady shrieked. Suddenly, another break, and I was being carried in a closed coffin, and I felt how the coffin was shaking and reflected upon it. For the first time, the idea struck me that I was dead. So this is about the posthumous in some ways. This is a story about the posthumous, about living after death. Suddenly it struck me that I was dead, utterly dead. I knew it and had no doubt about it. I could neither see nor move. I mean, just think for a moment what that means. Remember the story by Edgar Allan Poe, Premature Burial, in which he wakes up and says, I suddenly realized I had died and had been buried. I was dead. There's a poem by Emily Dickinson around the same time as Edgar Poe was writing. Said, a fly buzzed when I died. A fly buzzed when I died. So there's a number of writers who have taken up this idea of what happens at the moment of death and a moment or so after death. Then they would say, I am dead. I realize I'm dead. And he's doing that here. I was dead, utterly dead. I knew it, no doubt of it. I could neither see nor move, and yet I was feeling and reflecting. But I was soon reconciled to position as one does in a dream, accepting the facts without disputing them. And now I was buried in the earth, and they all went away. I was left alone, utterly alone, did not move. Whenever before I had imagined being buried, the one sensation I associated with the grave was that of the damp and the cold. So now I felt I was very cold, especially the tips of my toes, but I felt nothing else. I lay, strange to say, I expected nothing, accepting without dispute that a dead man had nothing to expect. But it was damp. I don't know how long the time passed, whether an hour, several days, many days. But all at once, a drop of water fell on my closed left eye, making its way through the coffin lid. I was followed a minute by a second, then a minute later by a third, and so forth, regular every minute. Suddenly, a glow of profound indignation in my heart. I suddenly felt pang in a physical pain. That's my wound, I thought. That's the bullet. And drop after drop every minute kept falling on my closed eyelid. And all at once, not with my voice, but my entire being, I called the power that was responsible for it happening to me. And I called out, whoever you may be, if you exist, if anything more rational, that what is happening here is possible. Maybe it should be then, suffer it to be here now. But if you are revenging yourself upon me for my senseless suicide by the hideousness and absurdity of this subsequent existence, then let me tell you that no torture could ever equal the contempt which I shall go on dumbly feeling. So he's still the underground man. He's exactly the same. Nothing has changed. Though my martyrdom may last 1,000,000 years, I made this appeal and I held my peace. There was a full minute of unbroken silence, and again another drop fell. But I knew with infinite, unshakable certainty that everything would change immediately. And behold, my grave was suddenly rent asunder. That is, I don't know whether it was open or was dug up, but I was caught up by some dark, unknown being. And we found ourselves in space. I suddenly regained my sight. It was the dead of night. I never had been there in such darkness. Never had there been such darkness. We were flying through space, far away from the earth. I did not question the being who was taking me. I was proud. I waited and assured myself that I was not afraid, and I was thrilled with ecstasy at the thought that I was not afraid. I did not know how long we were flying. I cannot imagine. It happened as always does in dreams when you skip over space and time. The laws of thought and existence only pause upon points for which the heart yearns. I remember that I suddenly saw in the darkness a star. Is that serious? I asked impulsively, though I had not meant to ask the question. No, that is the star you saw between the clouds when you were coming home, the being who was carrying me replied. I knew it had been something like a human face, strange to say. I did not like that being, and in fact, I felt an intense aversion for it. I expected complete non-existence, and that was why I had put the bullet through my heart. And here I was in the hands of a creature, not human, of course, but yet living and existing. So he's angry at the way in which he's died. This is almost comedy. And so there is life beyond the grave, I thought, with a strange frivolity that one has in dreams. But in the innermost depth of my heart, things remained unchanged. And if I have got to exist again, I thought, and live once more under the control of some irresistible power, I won't be vanquished and humiliated. I refuse. You know that I'm afraid of you and despise you for that. I said to my companion, unable to refrain from the humiliating question, which implied a confession, and my feeling my humiliation stabbed my heart as with a pin. Did not answer my question, but all at once I felt he was not even despising me. He was laughing at me and had no compassion for me, and that our journey had an unknown and mysterious object that concerned me only. Fear was growing in my heart. Something was mutely, painfully communicated to me from my silent companion, permeated my whole being. We were flying through dark, unknown space. I had for some time lost sight of the constellations familiar to my eyes. I knew there were stars in the heavenly spaces, the light of which took thousands of millions of years to reach the earth. Perhaps we were already flying through those spaces. I expected something with terrible anguish, tortured my heart, and I suddenly caught sight of our sun. I knew that it could not be our sun that gave life to the earth, and we were an infinite distance from our sun. But for some reason, I knew in my whole being that it was a sun exactly like ours, a duplicate of ours, a double of ours, we could say. A sweet, thrilling feeling resounded with ecstasy in my heart. The kindred power of the same light which had given me light stirred an echo in my heart and awakened it. And I had sensation of life, the old life of the past, for the first time since I had been in the grave. Okay. But if that is the sun, if that is exactly the same as our sun, I cried, where is the earth? And if my companion pointed to a star twinkling in the distance where there were light, we were flying straight towards it, towards the earth. Wow. And such repetitions possible in the universe? Can it be a law of nature that if there is an earth there, can it be just the same earth as ours, just the same as poor, unhappy, but unprecious, but precious and beloved forever, arousing in the most ungrateful of her children the same poignant love for her that we feel for our earth? I cried out, shaken by irresistible, ecstatic love for the old familiar earth which I had left, the image of the poor child who I had repulsed and flashed through my mind. Again, the girl's in his mind there. Okay, we're moving almost towards the end of the story here. You shall see it all, my companion said, and answered my companion. There was a note of sorrow in his voice. Yeah. Did I miss something?
Okay.
Flash in my mind, a companion. Yeah, we shall see it all, right? That's the top of it. We were rapidly approaching the planet. Yeah, there you have it. Yeah, rapidly approaching the planet, glowing before my eyes. I could already distinguish the ocean, the outline of Europe. Suddenly, a feeling of great, holy jealousy. The word holy there, holy jealousy, glowed in my heart. How can it be repeated? For what? I love and can love only that earth which I left, stained with my blood. And when in my ingratitude, I quenched with my life a bullet in my heart. But I've never ceased to love that earth. And perhaps on that very night I parted from it, I loved it even more than ever. Is there suffering beyond this new earth? On our earth, we can only love with suffering and through suffering. We cannot love otherwise, and we know of no other sort of love. I want suffering in order to love. I long, I thirst in this very instance to kiss with tears the earth that I left. And I won't accept life on any other. But my companion had already left me. And suddenly, quite without noticing how, I found myself on this other earth. In the bright light of a sunny day, fair as paradise. I believe I was standing on one of the islands that make up the globe of the Greek archipelago, or on the coast of the mainland facing that archipelago. And everything was exactly as it was with us, only everything seemed to have a festive radiance, the splendor of some great holy event. Notice the word holy. Holy event attained. The caressing sea, the green as emerald, splashed softly upon the shore and kissed it with manifest, almost conscious love. The tall, lovely trees stood in all the glory of their blossom. Their innumerable leaves greeted me, I'm certain, with soft, caressing rustle. Notice the word caressing gets repeated there. Caressing rustle, and seemed to articulate words of love. Grass glowed with bright and fragrant flowers. Birds were flying in flocks in the air and perched fearlessly. Look at the F's, the way the translation has picked out all the F's in order to make it smooth and make a nice, good feeling about it. Fearlessly on my shoulders and arms, joyfully struck me with their darling fluttering, as the F again, fluttering wings. And at last I saw and knew the people of this happy land. That came to me of themselves. They surrounded me. They kissed me. The children of the sun, the children of their son. Oh, how beautiful they were. Never had I seen them on earth, such beauty in mankind, only perhaps in our children. In the earliest years, one might find some remote reflection of that beauty. The eyes of these happy people shone with clear brightness. Their faces were radiant with the light of reason and fullness of a serenity that comes of perfect understanding. Those faces were gay. In the words and voices was a note of childlike joy. Oh, from the first moment, from the first glance at them, I understood it all. It was the earth untarnished by the fall. On it lived people who had not sinned. They lived just in such a paradise as that, in which, according to all the legends of mankind, our first parents lived. Our first parents lived before they sinned. The only difference was that all this earth was the same paradise. These people, laughing joyfully, thronged around me, caressed me. They took me home with them. That each of them used to reassure me. They asked me no questions, but they seemed, I fancied, to know everything without asking, and they wanted to make haste to smooth away the signs of the suffering from my face. And now we go to chapter 4. Things are going to change here in a minute, unfortunately. You know what? Well, granted that it was only a dream, yet the sensation of the love of those innocent and beautiful people has remained with me ever. And I feel as though their love is still flowing out to me from there. I have seen them myself, have known them, and been convinced that I love them. I love them, I suffered for them afterwards only. Oh, I understood at once, even at that time, in many things I could not understand them at all, as up to date Russian progressive and contemptible Petersburger that I was. It struck me as inexplicable that knowing so much, they had, for instance, no science like ours. Remember, I talked about science with the underground men there. No science like ours. But I soon realized that their knowledge was gained and fostered by intuitions different from those of us on earth, and that their aspirations too were quite different. They desired nothing and were at peace. They did not aspire to knowledge of life that we aspire to and understand it, because of their lives were full. Their knowledge was higher, deeper than ours. For our science seeks to explain what life is, aspires to understand it in order to teach others how to love, while they, without their science, knew how to live. And that I understood, but I could not understand their knowledge. They showed me their trees. I could not understand the intense love with which they looked at them. It was as though they were talking with creatures like themselves, and perhaps I shall not be mistaken if I say that they conversed with them. Yes, they found their language of the trees, I guess. They found a language, and I am convinced that that the trees understood them. They looked at all nature like that, but like the animals, at the animals who lived in peace with them, and did not attack them, but loved them. Thinking of the dog downstairs, the white dog. So it's a nice dog there. And the trees conquered by their love. They pointed to the stars. They told me something about them which I could not understand, but I am convinced that they were somehow in touch with the stars, not only in thought, but by some living channel. Oh, these people did not persist in trying to make me understand them. They loved me without that, but I knew that they would never understand me, and so I hardly spoke to them about our earth. I only kissed in their presence the earth in which they lived and mutely worshipped them themselves, and they saw that, and they let me worship them without being abashed at my adoration, and they themselves loved, and they themselves, not without being abashed at my adoration, for they themselves loved much. They were not happy on my account when at times I kissed their feet with tears, joyfully conscious of the love with which they would respond to mine. At times, I asked myself with wonder how it was that they were able never to offend a creature like me, and never once to arouse a feeling of jealousy or envy in me. I often wondered how I could be like that, boastful, untruthful as I was. I never talked to them of what I knew, of which, of course, they had no notion, that I was never tempted to do so by a desire to astonish or even to benefit them. They were as gay and sportive as children. They wandered about their lovely woods, copses. They sang their lovely songs. Their fare was light. The fruit of their trees, the honey from their woods, the milk of the animals who loved them. They did for food, and raiment was brief, not laborious. They loved and begot children, but I never noticed in them the impulse of that cruel sensuality which overcomes almost every man on this earth, and all and each, and is the source of almost every sin of mankind on the earth. They rejoiced at the arrival of children as new beings to share their happiness. There was no quarreling, no jealousy among them, and they did not even know what the words meant. Their children were the children of all, for they made up one family. There was scarcely any illness among them. Though there was death, their old people died peacefully, as though falling asleep, giving blessings, smiling to those who surrounded them to take their last farewell with bright and lovely smiles. I never saw grief or tears on those occasions, but only love, which reached the point of ecstasy, and calm ecstasy made perfect and contemplative. It's hard to read this and not really like it, you know. You really feel, wouldn't it be nice if things were like this? And, yeah. One might think that they were still in contact with the departed after death, that their earthly union was not cut short by death. They scarcely understood me when I questioned them about immortality, but evidently they were so convinced of it that without reasoning, that it was not for them a question at all. They had no temples, but they had a real, living, uninterrupted sense of oneness with the whole of the universe. They had no creed, but they had a certain knowledge that when the earthly joy had reached the limit of earthly nature, then it would come for them, the living and for the dead, a still greater fulfillment of contact with the whole universe would ensue. They looked forward. Did I miss something here? Okay. No impulse, no temples. They looked forward to the moment when, with joy, without hope, not pinning it, this the moment of death, for seeming to have a foretaste of it in their hearts as they talked to one another. This is all going to change very quickly, unfortunately. We're going to see. How are we doing time-wise here? We're almost at the end of this story. In the evening, before going to bed, to sleep, they liked the singing in musical and harmonious chorus. In those songs, they expressed all the sensations that the parting day had given them, sang glories, took leave of it, sang the praises of nature, of the sea, the woods. They liked making songs about one another, praised each other like children. They were simple songs, but they sang the simplest songs, but they sprang from their hearts and went to one's heart. And not only in their songs, but their lives, they seemed to do nothing but admire one another. It was like being in love with each other, but an all-embracing, universal feeling. Some of their songs, solemn and rapturous, I scarcely understood at all. Though I understood the words, I could never fathom their full significance. It remained, as it were, beyond the grasp of my mind, yet my heart unconsciously absorbed it more and more. I often told them that I had a presentiment of it long before, that this joy and glory had come to me on our earth in the form of a yearning melancholy, and that at times approached insufferable sorrow, that I had a foreknowledge of them and of all their glory and the dreams of my heart and the visions of my mind, that often on earth I could not look at the setting sun without tears. that in my hatred of the men of our earth, there was always a yearning anguish, why I could not hate them without loving them. Yet I could not help forgiving them. And in my heart for them, there was a yearning grief, why I could not love them without hating them. They listened to me, and I saw that they could not conceive what I was saying, but I did not regret that I had spoken to them of it. And I knew that they understood the intensity of my yearning anguish, my yearning anguish over those days, over those whom I had left. But when they looked at me with their sweet eyes full of love, remember I couldn't to the next page, when I felt that in their presence my heart too became innocent, and just as there's the feeling of the fullness of the life took my breath away, and I worshiped them in silence. Oh, everyone laughs at my face now, assures me that one cannot dream of such details as I am telling you. That I only dreamt or felt one sensation arose in my heart in delirium, made up the details myself when I woke up. And when I told them that perhaps it was really so, my God, how they shouted with laughter in my face and with what mirth I caused. Yes, of course, I was overcome the more sensations of my dream that was all preserved in my cruelty, in my cruelly wounded heart. But the actual forms and images of my dream, that is, the very ones I saw at the time of my dream, were filled with such harmony, were so lovely and enchanting, were so actual, that on awaking, I was, of course, incapable of clothing them in our poor language, so that they were bound to become blurred in my mind. And so perhaps I was really forcing afterwards to make up the details. And so, of course, to distort them in my passionate desire to convey some of them as quickly as I could. But on the other hand, how can I help believing that it was all true? I believe it was all true, and I found the truth. It was perhaps 1,000 times brighter, happier, more joyful than I described. Granted that I dreamed it, yet must have been real. You know, I will tell you a secret. Perhaps it was not a dream at all. Then something happened awful, something so horribly true that it could not have been imagined in a dream. My heart may have originated the dream, but would my heart alone have been capable of originating the awful event which happened to me afterwards? Now he's going to begin to try to describe that awful event. How could I alone have invented it or imagined my dream? Could my petty heart, fickle and trivial mind have risen to such a revelation of truth? My judge, judge for yourselves. Hitherto I have concealed it, but now I will tell the truth. The fact is, I corrupted all. Chapter 5, and I believe this is the last chapter, if I'm not mistaken. Yes. In the end, it ended in my corrupting them all. How could it come to pass? I don't know. I remember it clearly. The dream embraced thousands of years and left me only a sense of the whole. I only knew that I was the cause of their sin and downfall. I was the cause of their sin and downfall. Like a vile trichina, like a germ of the plague, infecting with whole kingdoms, so I contaminated all this earth, like a disease, in other words, right? Like I'm a disease. So happy and sinless before my coming, they learned to lie. They grew fond of lying, and they discovered the charm of falsehood. Oh, at first, perhaps it began innocently with a jest, coquetry, with amorous play, perhaps indeed with a germ. But that germ of falsity made its way into their hearts, pleased them. Their sensuality was soon begotten. Sensuality begot jealousy, jealousy, cruelty. I don't know. I don't remember, but soon, very soon, the first blood was shed. They marveled, they were horrified, began to split up and divide. They formed into unions, but it was against one another. Reproaches, upbraidings followed. They came to know shame, and shame brought them to virtue. The conception of honor sprang up, and every union began waving its flags. They began torturing animals. The animals withdrew from them into the forest and became hostile to them. They began struggling for separation, for isolation, for individuality, for ego, we could say, and for mine and for thine. And they began to talk in different languages, like the chapter 10 of the Bible. They began talking different languages. They became acquainted with sorrow and loved sorrow. They thirsted for suffering, and they said that truth could only be attained through suffering. And then science suddenly appeared, and they became wicked. They began talking of brotherhood and humanitarianism, understood those ideas, and they became criminal. And they invented justice and drew up whole legal codes in order to observe it and to ensure their being kept up. They set up a guillotine like the French Revolution. They hardly remembered what they had lost. And in fact, they refused to believe that they had ever been happy and innocent. They even laughed at the possibility of this happiness in the past, and they called it a dream. They could not even imagine it in the form, in a definite form and shape, but a strange, wonderful dream to relate, though they had lost all faith in their past and happiness, and they called it a legend, and so they longed to be happy and innocent once again, though they had that they lost their faith in their past and their happy, called the legend. They longed to be happy and innocent once again, more than they had succumbed to this desire like children, and made an idol of it. They set up temples, worshipped their own ideas, their own desires, though at the same time they fully believed that it was unattainable and could not be realized. They bowed down to it. They adored things with tears. Nevertheless, if it could have been that they had returned to the innocent and happy condition they had lost, and if somehow someone had shown it to them again and asked them whether they wanted to go back, they certainly would have refused. They answered me, "We may be deceitful and wicked and unjust, we know it, and weep over it, we grieve over it, we torment and punish ourselves more perhaps than that merciful judge who will judge us and whose name we know not. But we have science, and by the means of it, we shall find the truth, and we shall arrive at it consciously. Knowledge is higher than feeling. The consequences of life is higher than life. Science will give us wisdom. Wisdom will reveal the laws. The knowledge of the laws of happiness is higher than happiness." That's what they said. And after saying such things, everyone began to love himself better than anyone else. And indeed, they could not do otherwise. All became so jealous of the rights of their own personality, the utter egoism, right? That they did their own utmost to curtail and destroy them in others, and made that the chief thing in their lives. Slavery followed, even voluntary slavery. The weak eagerly submitted to the strong, on condition that the latter aided them to subdue them, the weaker, and that they were saints who came to these people weeping and talked to them of their pride and of their loss of harmony and of the in due proportion and of their loss of shame. And they were laughed at and pelted with stones. Holy blood, there's the word holy again. Holy blood was shed on the threshold of temples. And there arose men who began to think how to bring all people together again, so that everyone, while still loving himself best of all, might not interfere with the others, and all might live together somehow in a harmonious society. Regular wars sprang up over this idea. All combatants at the same time firmly believed that science, wisdom, the instinct of self-preservation would force men at last to unite to a harmonious, rational society. And so, meanwhile, to hasten matters, the wise endeavored to exterminate as rapidly as possible all those who were not wise and did not understand their idea, and that the latter might not hinder its triumph, but that the instinct of self-preservation grew rapidly weaker. The instinct of self-preservation would force them last minute to harmonious and rational, and meanwhile, to hasten matters, not understand their idea, that the latter might hinder its triumph. But the instinct of self-preservation grew rapidly weaker. There arose men haughty and sensual who demanded all or nothing. In order to obtain everything they resorted to crime. And if they did not succeed, then to suicide. There arose religions with a cult of non-existence, of self-destruction for the sake of the everlasting peace of annihilation. It was extraordinary stuff. It's amazing how accurate about history it is. Everlasting peace of annihilation. At last, these people grew weary of their meaningless toil, frightened signs of suffering came into their faces, and they proclaimed that suffering was a beauty for in suffering alone what there was meaning. They glorified suffering in their songs. I moved about among them, wringing my hands, weeping over them, but I loved them perhaps more than in old days when there was no suffering in their faces and when they were innocent and lovely. I loved them. I loved the earth that they had polluted, it says. I loved the earth they had polluted even more than when it had been a paradise, if only because sorrow had come to it. Alas, I always loved sorrow and tribulation, but only for myself, but I wept over them, pitying them. I stretched out my hands to them in despair, blaming, cursing, despising myself. I told them that all was my doing, mine alone, and that it was mine who had brought them to corruption, damnation, and falsity. I had besought them to crucify. I besought them to crucify me. I taught them how to make a cross. I could not kill myself. I had not the strength, but I wanted to suffer at their hands. I yearned for suffering. I longed that my blood should be drained to the last drop in their agonies, in these agonies, sorry. But they only laughed at me. They began at last to look upon me as crazy. They justified me. We could just substitute the word ridiculous there, I guess. Justified me. They declared they had only got what they wanted themselves, and that they now had, and that all that now was lost my question. That all now could not have been otherwise. At last, they declared to me that I was becoming dangerous, and they should lock me up in a madhouse if I did not hold my tongue. And then grief took possession of my soul, that my heart was willing, and I felt as though I were dying. And then I woke up. All right, now we have the very end of the story. It was morning. That is, it was not yet daylight. About 6, I woke up in the same armchair. My candle had burned out. Everything was asleep. Everyone was asleep in the captain's room. There was stillness all around it, rare and flat. First of all, I leapt in great amazement. Nothing like this had ever happened to me before in my life, not even in the most trivial detail. I had never, for instance, fallen asleep like this in my armchair. While I was standing and coming to myself, I suddenly caught sight of my revolver lying loaded, ready, but instantly thrust it away. Oh, now, life. I lifted my hands and called upon eternal truth, not with words, but with tears, with ecstasy, immeasurable ecstasy flooded my soul. Life, yes, life, spreading the good ideas. I had at that moment resolved to spread the tidings, and resolved it, of course, for my whole life. I go to spread the tidings. I want to spread the tidings of what? The truth. I have seen it. I have seen it with my own eyes. I have seen the glory. And since then, I have been preaching, becomes a preacher. Moreover, I love all those things, all those who left me more than all the rest. Why is that so? I do not know. I cannot explain, but so be it. I am told that I am vague and confused. And if I am vague and confused now, what shall I be later on? It's true indeed. I am vague and confused, and perhaps as time goes on, I shall be more so. Of course, I shall make many blunders before I find out how to preach. That is, find out what words to say, what things to do. For it's a very difficult task. I see all that clear as daylight. But listen, who does not make mistakes? And yet, all are making, and yet, all are making for the same goal. All are striving in the same direction anyway, from the sage to the lowest robber, only by different roads. An old truth, but it's one but this is what is new. I cannot go far wrong, for I have seen the truth. I have seen and I have known the truth, and know that people can be beautiful and happy without losing the power of living on the earth. I will not and cannot believe that evil is the normal condition of mankind. And it is just this faith of mine that they laugh at. But how can I help believing it? I have seen the truth. It is not as though I invented it with my mind. I've seen it, and the living image of it has filled my soul forever. I've seen it in such perfection that I cannot believe it's impossible for people to have it. And so how can I go wrong? I shall make some slip, no doubt, and and shall perhaps talk in secondhand language, but not for long. The living image of what I saw will always be with me and always correct and guide me. I'm full of courage and freshness. I will go on as if it were for 1,000 years. You know, at first I meant to conceal the fact that I corrupted him, but that was a mistake. Of course, that was my first mistake. But truth whispered to me that I was lying and preserved me and corrected me. But how establish paradise? I don't know, because I don't know how to put it in words. After my dream, I lost command of words, all the chief words, anyway, the most necessary ones. But never mind, I shall go on and I shall keep talking. I won't leave off. For anyway, I have seen it with my own eyes. I cannot describe what it was, but the scoffers do not understand. It was a dream. What's a dream? Is not our life a dream? And I will say more. Suppose this paradise will never come to pass that I understand. And yet I shall go on preaching it, and how simple it is. One day in our hour, everything could be arranged at once. The chief thing is to love others like yourself. The chief thing is to love others like yourself. That's the chief thing, and that's everything. Nothing else is wanted. Nothing else is wanted. See if I can go on here. Yeah. Nothing else is wanted. You will find out at once how to arrange things, and it's an old truth which has been told billions of times, but it has not formed part of our lives. The consciousness of life is higher than life. Consciousness of life is higher than life. The knowledge of the laws of happiness is higher than happiness. That is what we must contend against. And I shall, if only everyone wants it, if only everyone wants it, then it can be arranged at once. And I track down the little girl, and I shall go on and out. I guess the other translation that I had used the word responsibility where the word love is used in here. It's the same thing. So it comes down to Leviticus, to love others as yourself, but not love the way you love yourself, but love others in place of loving yourself. But instead of loving yourself, love others. In other words, not the way I understand what he's saying is not to consider it as our lives as autonomous, as self-namers, but as heteronymous. Hetero means the other, that we come from the other, that loving the other in place of loving ourselves is the way to start. Seems to me that's what he's saying. So what I want to do at this point, I want to stop and ask you what your responses are to what we've been saying, and does this give us a way in which literature, at least in Dostoyevsky, I guess maybe I'll go back from. How seriously is this? Is this Dostoyevsky preaching? Is this a fiction of some kind Dostoyevsky has created? Well, obviously, he staged this, but is it simply a staged name for what the writer believes, or is there some character or some fiction going on here that we're not taking stock of? Be interested in responses from you guys or responses from the audience.
Okay, thank you for reading. Now, if anyone has any comment, please write into chat or raise a hand, and I will give you the right to talk. Okay, what are your thoughts?
What are your thoughts, guys?
Yeah.
I thought it was I think the utopia this Dostoevsky wanted to create. I think it's himself, not a fictional character.
It's himself. It's himself that he wants us to. Yeah. Okay.
Like the responsibility.
Responsibility.
Yeah. The notion of responsibility is shown also. It's so strange how he describes everything in dream, and then suddenly he wakes up, acts like it was actually a dream, and the descriptions he does is just too deep, and
it's quite overwhelming, isn't it?
Yeah, really overwhelming.
Quite overwhelming.
Really overwhelming.
Yes.
Really.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
I agree with the fact that it was quite overwhelming.
Quite overwhelming. Yeah.
And I guess I'm just not so sure about I'm quite skeptical, but about loving others is the way to
And I'm not trying to preach here. I'm just trying to understand what he's saying. Seems to me that what he's saying is not another version of ego, but what he's saying is somehow we have to begin with loving others in order to love ourselves, in order to find who we are. But maybe he's not, or maybe that's not the answer. But just trying to understand what Dostoyevsky, what at least the character of Dostoyevsky presents us with is trying to. But say more about what is it that bothers you about that?
No, just I don't bother me. Just
Not bothers, it's too strong. But
Maybe.
how would you? How? What would you put in place of that, or what would you? How would you revise that? If you, let's say you, Dostoyevsky, were coming to you, you were the publisher. You said, okay,
I guess
Theodore, here's what you could do.
instead of maybe like start with sounds cheesy to say that maybe self-loving yourself, and that way you can go for those.
Okay, stop loving yourself. Okay.
But it's
Yeah.
I'm still trying to take everything in.
Yeah, it's a lot to take in. There's a lot of stuff going on here. It's very, yeah.
But okay, my question would be, but okay, this part where everything was ideal, everything was perfect,
Yes.
society, I don't know. My feeling was I wouldn't like to live there.
Yeah.
What was your impression? Would you like to live where everyone's adoring everyone? I feel that's fake.
Yeah.
Something's missing. Yeah.
We can't quite take that seriously in some ways. That is, he has to create a fiction like that in order to say what he's going to say later on.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But isn't that can't we feel that there is some opposition between like Apollo and Dionysus?
Yeah.
Similar, like we were reading Euripides,
Yeah.
where we have some order, ideal society, or some fullness, and then we have some opposition. And here we may feel that these people who were adoring and enjoying their life, they were like they liked this opposite. They liked lying. They started feeling that some joy in lying and so on. So isn't that in real world usually the culture already reads that we have like two oppositions. It's like chaos, ideal, some ideal society or ideal order, and our real life is like a mix of these two, or maybe sometimes even some fight between these two.
So you say maybe in some way Dostoevsky has created a character who has created this illusion in order to sustain what it is as a kind of ideology. The ideology means you retrospectively create what leads up to where you are. You've actually really begun with where you are. You're trying to, it's a justification of where you are. So he creates this ideal society in which he could not live in order to be able to say, now I'm a preacher and now I'm doing this. So this might turn out to be just one more self-justification or self-rationalization. This might be what Dostoevsky thinks, or it might be Dostoevsky being critical of a character who is self-justifying, right? And it's kind of hard to tell the difference. We can get to choose, if you like, which we would like to read. We can read it either way, potentially, and it can be for me one way and for someone else another way.
But isn't again? Dostoevsky finishes by explaining that he is loving. Now we have a corrupted society.
Yeah.
But he is loving everyone. But isn't that he is doing so because he feels guilty and therefore responsible? For them. They were innocent, and now he showed a sin. And now everyone is enjoying, sinful life.
Right.
And now what's left to the creator or, the author of this corrupt society is just to love them.
Right. Yeah, the chief thing, just reading again the text, the chief thing is to love others like yourself. That's the chief thing. Everything else, and that's everything. Nothing else is wanted. That's just what the text says. Yeah. So maybe that's where he has begun, and maybe he's had a kind of conversion or a failure or a mental breakdown, if you like, at the moment when he raises the gun to kill himself, and he realizes he's kind of thinks ahead, so to speak. That let's say he were in analysis, and someone said, "Well, think about that moment when you held the gun up to your head. You're thinking about shooting your head, but then you actually aim it towards your heart, and so forth." And then is there not more to be said about that moment? Maybe we're in a psychoanalytic situation. Well, yeah, I guess I was imagining this and imagining that. I said, well, if that's true, are you not justifying yourself then by imagining this dream of a perfect world in which everything worked out that really couldn't function in the world that we live in? Mm-hmm. So in other words, is it simply not the inverse of your own self-justification right now?
Yeah. Also, what this short story reminds me of, it's like a psychoanalytic theory presented by Jacques Lacan.
Jacques Lacan, yeah.
Where he says that, usually we are expecting that we will reach fullness at some point in the future. But Lacan would say that this fullness, the part is, we already were full, before we were born, before we went into this world. And that means that now maybe that could be the reason to love everyone, right? Because we know that now we are already out of the ideal state. Right. Now we are here where we are, but maybe we can think about that, okay, I'm responsible because, like all of us, we were in fullness, in wholeness. And now, all of us are in situation where we are fighting with each other and maybe playing power games or something like that.
Right. Jacques Lacan, I don't know if you're familiar, has this theory that we exist always in three registers. It calls it RSI. And the registers are the imaginary, the symbolic, and the real. And words do not in English mean imaginary and symbolic and real the way we customarily in English use those words. So imaginary is everything going on inside of our head. The symbolic would be everything going on in culture, including what's beyond imagination, what's in any individual is able to imagine. And then the real would be everything that's outside of culture, that cultures are not able to imagine. Sometimes the real is called the impossible. The impossible. And so it may be that this is simply an interaction with a shift to another symbolic structure for the imaginary, that he's been imagining one imaginary structure, and that suddenly at the moment of death, at the moment of the intrusion potentially of the real, of the impossible, when he actually says that there will be nothing possible after this, then suddenly the possibility of that impossible compels him to imagine an alternative reality, such as, for example, what this paradise, that he is in fact the source of the corruption. Maybe that's a better way to organize. It's almost like his psyche is thinking independently of him, which is what the symbolic allows us to do. What goes on in our head is what goes on in our head, but it doesn't mean that culture has not, to some extent, the symbolic has not inspired that construction among individuals in some way. And so what goes on in our head then suddenly changes. Now he has this new vision. So that would be one possible way of understanding that, or another possible way of understanding what we've been saying here.
And also, for example, if you could follow Slavoj Žižek, one of the followers of Lacan. So why did Dostoyevsky wake up? It was like he probably was not able to cope with the real, with the guilt He was feeling within,
Yeah.
and the only way to escape the real is to get into conscious state and live some lucid dream.
Yes.
Just now getting away of the real that is available us maybe through dream, and that's why we are trying to escape of that.
Right. So the dream would be, as it was for Freud, who was,
Yeah.
of course, central for Lacan. The a rebus would be simply a rebus. It would be a way of acting out or performing this thought. That it's not getting the desire, but it's performing the desire.
But
Yeah.
but probably it's very interesting to get. I don't know. Maybe this story is a nice way to empathize with the creator. You know?
Yeah.
So what happens if you ruin everything? You know, and
Yes.
you're responsible for everything, and you come into some Indian society and you ruin everything, spoil everything.
So it gives you a way of recognizing how it could become possible for Dostoevsky to imagine a character who would say, I am guilty of everything before everyone, and me more than anyone, without, in fact, having done the deed. Any more than this character imagines himself to be the origin of corruption. What we don't have in this story is any account of how, in fact, he corrupted them. I mean, there's kind of hints about it. I would tell them stories of what went on, and they began to imitate what went on. And they shared it with each other, and then they began to feel shame, and so it's through it. We could imagine that it's through imitation that they began to take on the world that the narrator recognizes as the earth that he left, and that the writer Dostoevsky could come to imagine a character like Dmitri, who did not kill his father in that novel. We're given factually to understand, to be able to say, I am guilty of everything before everyone, and we want that.
But doesn't that mean that guilt and responsibility correlate very
Yes,
much?
very much. That in some ways, it's a way of saying what I am elected to do, what no one else, what is my real individuality is the extent to which I can free myself from certain kinds of actions, and this is actually very close to something that Jean-Paul Sartre said. He said that freedom, we tend to think of freedom as choice, but freedom is really what he uses the French word called négation. He said it's really the ability to free ourselves from things. Négation, people who speak French would understand as a way of not doing. It's a capacity to not do, and that is what becomes liberating. It's not that we're living in some undetermined space somewhere, but it's the capacity to not do what we're doing, as if we're always already doing something. We always find ourselves in a situation in which the action doing happenings are taking place all the time. We're never not in a place of doing, but freedom is what allows us to give up the doing that is already taking place. So what responsibility would be to own my capacity to be guilty of everything, to be capable. Guilty or capable would be in the same way, capable of doing anything but it's my responsibility that allows me to understand my freedom. My freedom would derive then from my responsibility and not the reverse. Sartre has an essay himself, which he's called, says, I think existentialism is a humanism, in which he argues that my freedom founds my responsibility. And what we've been saying in this course is that Levinas takes a certain distinction from that, and reverses those ideas, and says that in fact my freedom derives from my responsibility, by recognition not of an adoption of responsibility. The responsibility is itself what is already categorical, what is already given. That I always find myself in a place of responsibility from which I can free myself not from responsibility, but I can free myself from acknowledging that responsibility. So the capacity I have for Levinas, as opposed for someone like Sartre, is that I can choose to not acknowledge the responsibility that I inevitably I have. It remains my responsibility. So that I can choose not to not acknowledge, or I can choose not to do it. I can, but it doesn't become less my responsibility because I've chosen not to do it. For Levinas. Again, we're just reading text. We're not preaching here. We're not making, not making suggestions about how to live, but we're simply trying to talk about how these thinkers that have that influence life and influence medical suffering, influence medical situations through this notion of suffering, which of course is where we're leading for next time. I mean, the whole thing, the theme of suffering, we haven't spent a lot of time today talking about, but the theme of suffering is is the connection to the medical.
Yeah. Now, some association came to my mind.
Yeah.
Regarding the story, for example, caring for dementia patients.
Yeah.
There is even scientifically, it's found that there is higher violence rates against the patients, dementia patients, as compared to others worldwide. It's a worldwide problem because sometimes people, let's say nurses or nurse assistants, sometimes become violent because of fear to get into the same situation, as this patient with dementia. Sometimes they don't know how to cope with that, with this fear, fundamental fear, and then sometimes they may become violent towards patients.
Yeah.
And one of the recommendations that is usually provided is to think about this person, this patient, as the person when he or she was lived normal life. For example, we have former president who's now have dementia. Let's imagine we have former president or businessman who has now dementia, and he or she's crazy, and we don't know how to cope with that. We may feel desperate, and then how can we feel compassion, by believing or by understanding that, again, this previous state of this person was like he was a president, a businessman, politician, just a good person or something like that. And this way, this guy, Dostoyevsky, also, why is he loving now this corrupted people? Because he knew this, where did they come from?
Yeah.
From fulfillment, from flourishing.
Yeah.
And this corruption is then easier to cope with. I understand this is a problem, but I love them because I know that they are innocent.
Because I know that they were innocent. Yeah. And so it also plays, of course, back on Shakespeare and Othello, who did not have the capacity to regard the innocence of Desdemona in that regard, and could only listen to certain rationalized language and imagine the narratives that came from that rationalized language to be that on which Othello would act against her to kill her, actually, in the case of Othello. Whereas here, their innocence he can say it's real. He can declare it to be, at least in the translation we have here, to be real.
What your insights? Yes, maybe someone on the web, on Teams.
Yeah, we want to be as open to people on the web.
There's something in the chat now.
No, I guess it was my message where I send an article that will be discussed in 2 days on Thursday. Yeah. So, if there are no comments, so what's the moral of the story? Don't be afraid to dream. What would be your moral?
That we can. It seems to me Dostoevsky is imagining that when things get really, really bad, we can find ways of owning our own responsibility, even if it sounds like we're doing so in the same way that we have shirked our responsibility. And we can rationalize and construct a dream in which that will allow us to think that we are responsible, which is all that becomes important if we imagine that what's most important is not what our thoughts are, but what our doings are. That the goal for, again, the context of Levinas, which is always what we're doing in here to think. The goal for Levinas is, what am I doing? What's happening? What is taking place? Is this allowing me to be nasty towards others, or to continue to play games with others, or is this compelling me to become a preacher, or is this compelling me to, in another case, to just become a writer, or is this compelling me to become a thinker? But what is the consequence of it? Where does this reading, this close reading of the text, lead us? It seems to me that's the moral always. It's not so much the truth that is articulated, but how we respond. We have the capacity to respond to whatever truth it is that seems to be available here, and that the way to do that is through what I call close reading, or in this case, reading prophetically, reading contextually, reading about the I'm trying to understand the strategies, the origins, and the consequences more than what's really true here. Right? That impulse to say what's really true here can lead us away, because anyone can say, here's what's really true. No, here's what's really true. And everyone has the capacity to say, here's what I think is really true. The question is, how do we move beyond that? I'm not arguing that what's really true is the prophetic. I'm arguing that that's a method for thinking about the world in which we function, that we get from literature. That literature is suggesting to us that prophetic thinking, by which literature means close reading, will allow us to understand more effectively ways of acting that might end up in a more harmonious consequence.
Okay, so thank you, Professor. Thank you, dear colleagues. Thank you, everyone, for joining this event. So see you for the last time on Thursday. Bye.